We've been dealing with peer pressure, all of us, since we were kids, and it goes throughout life. And the pressure to conform to a certain behavior or belief can be really strong. And the research on conformity, the famous research, well, people will conform to something and say something that's untrue if they feel that everybody else is going along with it. And so I think one thing you have to think about is how can you create context where people can be more honest about their expressions.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the latest in Heterodox Academy's series of virtual events. Our topic today is peer pressure and the suppression of viewpoint diversity on campus. And I'm joined by some wonderful panelists who've agreed to spend about an hour with us chewing on this fascinating topic. We'll make sure that we have a bunch of time for audience questions. This will also be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel, and you'll find it elsewhere around the internet. My name is Michael Regnier. I'm the executive director at HXA. On behalf of John Tomasi, our president, and our whole team, we're just excited to see so many of you here. We look like we're approaching 300 participants on the line, so we're really glad to have you. And just imagine yourself in a big lecture hall where all kinds of diverse views are welcome. As we get started today, I just want to follow our routine of reminding everyone to follow the HXA way. Make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and be yourself. And one place where you can be all those things is in the Q&A box. We'll be using that throughout the event to gather your questions. We won't be able to get to them all, I can tell you that, but we will be listening, and someone from our team will help notice which are common questions so that we can share them with panelists as much as time allows. I'd like to now introduce our panel. We're joined by 4 academics who have perspectives on this issue and who not only come from different disciplines, but from different roles and perspectives within the academy. So Jan Searcy is Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Cal State University Northridge. Jay Van Bavel is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at NYU. Kevin Walston is Professor of Political Science at Cal State U Long Beach. And Megan Lonsinger is a PhD candidate in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. So we have an East Coast, West Coast thing going on today, but we're not going to let those social identities swamp our search for truth. I'm going to finally invite all of you, if you are seeing this on recording or if you are watching with us live, to consider joining HXA. If you are a professor, a student, a higher education administrator, or staff member of any kind, we'd love to have you. Membership is free, and we explore all kinds of interesting topics and work to advance the values of open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. You can follow us online, come to our website, and sign up for a newsletter. Near the end of our program, we'll also tell you more about how you can follow the panelists that we have with us today. So with that, I'm eager to get started. As a first question, and Jan, I think I'll pose this one to you. We have seen a lot of hot discussion around the country about the formal side of freedom of speech issues. And those are so important, the laws, the policies, the official practices that go on. But we're social creatures, and we pay attention to a lot more than that. Even if we can share, let's say, an unpopular opinion in the classroom, that doesn't mean that we necessarily will. So beyond the formal protections, are there things that colleges and universities should be doing to shape the social dynamics that are going on in higher ed?
Thank you for the question. And most definitely, there are things that universities can signal. And at the college level, I've done that, at least with the chairs and with the departments that are here. But let me start by even going to freshman orientation as an example, and that the university should set the tone. and the expectation that students are going to be challenged and it's going to be uncomfortable, that there are going to be points where they may be raised with a certain value set, but the information that they're going to be exposed to is going to challenge those core issues. And it's going to be emotionally, spiritually, and in some cases, even physically challenging for them, and to be open to the experience. And most of us, all of us in the academy, trumpet the academy as being a place for transformation. And we can signal that. And I often tell students that your mind is a muscle. And I use the gym analogy. And I state that when you first start working out, it hurts and you want to stop. And so you start either lifting weights or you're doing that workout, and it's difficult. What I say is that you have to keep on coming back, and you have to keep on working out, and then your muscle rebuild, and they rebuild in a stronger way to be able to handle how it's going to be challenged, how it's going to be torn down. And so I use that example when I share that with students. I see your mind operates the same way. So with orientation, and also being repeated, that's what we need to do. So that's how we can signal. I also suggest that, and this is a student affairs issue, I'm on the academic side as an academic dean, but within house at Cal State Northridge, the deans have had this conversation that when we bring speakers to campus that might have an alternative view, that there are student groups and student organizations that say, well, what are you doing funding these people? What are you doing? You're supporting their cause. And so collectively as deans, we have shared that, no, we're not supporting them, but what we are doing is supporting the academic enterprise of engaging these difficult topics and these challenges. And this is part of the university experience. So do not equate and confound us bringing a speaker to campus, and we do have to compensate them with supporting a particular position. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So to that point, we've actually seen some high profile shout downs and other real conflicts that have come up, particularly around guest speakers. And I know that guest speakers can sometimes be a way to safely, I suppose, introduce some uncommon opinions or opinions that students don't feel comfortable talking about, but then it can sort of take a turn. And I was struck by a commentary recently after a high profile incident where a student at that school said, actually, there's just a few. It's a sort of a very vocal minority on one side and a vocal minority on the other side, and everyone else is sort of keeping their head down. So Jay, maybe I can direct this one to you. You have written a lot about how, we are social chameleons. We can have different socially shared identities. But it seems like sometimes students get locked into like a persistent identity about, being politically this or that. Are there things as a professor that you can do to make a different kind of identity more salient and prevent some of this?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to affirm your point. There was a study that I was going to mention about who censors people they don't agree with. At least this study was with online political conversations. And it does tend to be driven, the desire to censor tends to be driven by a small number of people who are extremely committed to a certain type of identity. And they're fused with that identity. It's a huge part of who they are. And so they want to censor their opposition. And this happens across the political spectrum. And so that is part of the dynamic of who wants to censor. And so, and that, I don't want to diminish the importance of people's identities. A lot of them are really important. I also think like being in college, a big part of it is like learning to care about things, learning who you are, understanding the power of dissent and protest. And for many students, this is the first time they've been, had the opportunity to do that in an environment where they can kind of express themselves. I do think that there is this dynamic, though, again, where it's often a small number of people who are trying to censor people. And so one thing you can do, I would say a couple things you can do. One is establish that norms are about engagement. One of the points Jan Dominic said was like, from the very first day, establish that this is normative in the organization or the institution. It's healthy and it's important. So I'll give you an example of this. It was done at University of Madison, Wisconsin. It was around DEI issues. And what they simply did was they polled the students and found that most of them valued inclusion and diversity, and they simply surfaced the norm and told the rest of them that this was valued. And what happened was people actually engaged in more inclusive behaviors because they thought it was normative. They thought that's what the average student wanted to do. And the minority students actually performed better. Their grades went up. So you could do something similar around like speech and engagement and diversity of perspectives. I bet what you'd find is that the majority of people actually want to be in a place where they can express themselves and have interesting conversations with people they disagree with. And then what you want to do is surface that norm, that this is part of who we are. It's part of what we value. It's part of like a rigorous educational environment that you're going to be challenged. And then the third thing I would say is I would underscore the value of dissent. And so there's lots of research, and there's something we write about it in my book. There's lots of research on who dissents and why, and what its functions are within a group. So groups that have more dissent, if you have a group of the dissenter, the group tends to reach better conclusions, even if the person who dissented was wrong. And the reason for that is because if someone dissents, even if they're wrong, they open up a wider range of discussion from other people in the group, and that helps bring forth better ideas and challenges the original way of doing things. And so dissent is value in and of itself, even if it's incorrect. So it's one thing I want to drive home. And then the other thing is, and this is my co-author Dominic Packer, his research finds that dissenting, of course, is really hard. And so who dissents? It's often the people who care most about the group. And so I just told you at the start of my comments that the people who are most highly identified and have these fused identities want to censor. But there's also a fact where the people who care most about the group, also high identifiers, if they think their group is going wrong, they're the ones who are most willing to stick their neck out and say something and try to challenge it. So there's something also important about that underscoring that dissent is not just from people who are rabble rousers. It's often from people who really care a lot about the group and where it's going. And so that's also an important piece of it, is when it's hard to dissent. We have a long history of treating dissenters really badly. We have a lot of mean names, from devil's advocates to rabble rousers and these types of things. So I think that you want to underscore also that when people are dissenting in a classroom or on campus somewhere, that it's valuable to the group's outcomes, and it's often because they care about the group.
Thank you. So dissenters, people who go against the grain in a classroom conversation or in another setting, they're actually adding value. They're doing us a service. They might be the people who care the most. Megan, I'll ask you sort of from a graduate student perspective. I have a feeling that's not the conventional wisdom in a lot of academic classrooms these days. It kind of gets framed a little differently, doesn't it?
I think so. I don't think that a lot of students believe that they're against free speech or viewpoint diversity. I see a lot of students believing in free speech to an extent, and some might place more limits than others. For context, my background is, yes, graduate student, Ivy League, but I was in community college. I transferred to a public university, and then now getting my doctorate at a private. And what I've noticed around is that, yeah, I think students, they are uncomfortable speaking to ideas generally, even very left-leaning students. I had two approach me in my own office hours this past semester. And not that they wanted to express a very conservative idea, let's say, or they had something that they thought was going to offend someone. They were afraid in general of speaking an opinion because they didn't know what kind of reaction they were going to get, even though they were very left-leaning typically. And I think that is the context that we're operating in, is a very left-leaning environment. And so you have students who are still left of center, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. And what I want to impress upon, how do we change the social climate of the university, to the question that you posed to Jan earlier, I think graduate students and adjunct faculty need to get a lot more involved. We talk about what faculty can do, we talk about what administrators can do to change the campus climate, and those are important classes of people. However, graduate students and adjunct faculty are doing a lot of the teaching on campus, sometimes the majority of teaching. And I've heard some very well-intentioned people give the advice to people like me: keep your head down, don't say anything too controversial, don't get called a racist on Twitter for saying something, whatever. And that advice is well-meaning, but we're teaching students now, and I can't wait until I get tenure, probably because I'm not going to get tenure because statistically there aren't the jobs for it. But I do want to see more grad students and adjunct faculty who are embracing viewpoint diversity actually do something about it and not just keep their heads down. If I say nothing else in this panel, that's what I want to get across.
Call to action. Thank you. So Kevin, I want to make sure we bring you in here. I know that you've also written and talked about how the majority of students are against things like, you know, a willingness to commit violence when they disagree with a speaker, and you've looked at some of that data. You're also a political scientist. What's your take on this issue of peer pressure and viewpoint diversity and how they're interacting on campus?
Yeah, I think I can respond to what some of the other panelists have offered already. The first thing I would say, and I'm coming from a perspective of somebody who's sort of pathologically obsessed with data. So to the extent that that's helpful in this conversation, I'm probably have something to offer. But just firstly on Jay's point, I would push back a little bit against the idea that this is a relatively small group of people. I think the size of the group of people who are willing to engage in censorship is often surprisingly large. And more importantly, it's not evenly distributed around the university. I think one of the things that's been really helpful over the last couple of years is for the first time we have survey data about how faculty members think, about how students think. So we've approached this sort of quote unquote free speech crisis in a kind of as a disaggregated or sort of rather an overly aggregated problem where we assume that every university has the same challenge, every part of the university has the same challenge. So that means faculty and adjuncts and administrators. And we assume that every student and student group is kind of dealing with the same problems. And I think that the data actually points us in a quite different direction. I think it's productive as we start thinking about solutions to what we imagine this problem to be, to sort of look into that. So just to Jay's point, this is not a survey of, and I'll post it in the link. It's not a survey of college students, but in 2021, 65% of strongly liberal people who self-identified as strongly liberal reported blocking somebody or reporting to somebody on social media. That's compared to 40% of people identify as strongly conservative. And this is a pattern that we've seen sort of play out in a variety of different domains and contexts. And I think it has to do, again, with fundamental differences about liberals and conservatives, a focus perhaps on harm or justice or fairness as opposed to a concern about liberty and freedom and equality. And I think what we need to start doing is recognizing that we have a kind of series of crises that are embedded in each other here. We have kind of a free speech crisis that's embedded in what I would argue is kind of a mental health crisis, which is further embedded within a friendship crisis. And some of Heterodox's Academy's own survey data sort of points us in the direction of this. Students who interact with others less frequently are far less comfortable communicating their opinions on campus. And when we start looking through the data about friendship, particularly for young men, nearly 20% of young men report not having a close friend. The number is slightly lower for women. But we have this again, sort of lack of interaction, let's say, that I think exists within the purview of universities to try to encourage. I think it's useful for us to think about solutions in this way, but I also really want to be attentive to the fact that the mental health struggles that our students are confronted with, I think everybody who's involved in any way in a university experiences this quite profoundly. This is not entirely disconnected from some of the free speech issues, some of the issues that we're sort of talking about more explicitly here. And I think we need to kind of consider them collectively as we think about strategies for how to solve some of these issues.
Jay, you were mentioned there, so you can get in on that if you want to, but no pressure, no peer pressure.
I appreciate Kevin, adding nuance to my perspective. So I was responding to some surveys I've seen where about 60% of students, 6 in 10 students on campuses from polls, think that universities and colleges should allow students to be exposed to all types of speech on campus. But that doesn't mean those people might say they support it and then in their private life, block somebody on Facebook. I've muted and blocked lots of people on social media over the years for all kinds of reasons. And yet I generally support, a broad discourse of ideas. So I would be maybe someone who would get caught as saying one thing, but maybe doing another. So I guess it also depends on how they mentally represent free speech and so forth. I tend to, so I guess it's how you measure it, how you encode it, what it means to people. People might, still want to mute, all kinds of individuals, even if they support, a broad array of discourse on campus. I think this is also another useful point, which is it's useful to define what we mean. And I would say the issue with extremists or people with very extreme positions is that they tend to score high on the most dogmatic beliefs. They become very rigid thinkers. They also score high in measures of belief superiority. They think they know better than other people. And so that makes those individuals, I also say the data I study, social media, do a lot of research on that. People who post the most toxic and hostile content online tend to be the most extreme. And it's not just that they post the most extreme and hostile content, they post at a rate that's much higher than other people, because people who are kind of have more nuanced or complex views or score higher in intellectual humility just tend to not post nearly as much. And so what happens when you have dynamics, especially in the online world, is you see also a false norm of, wow, it looks like people are more extreme than I thought, but that's because the most extreme people post by far the most and have the most followers and therefore dominate the conversations. And so I also think there's some dynamic where colleges and universities and classrooms should think about ways to surface a broader variety of ideas, including people who have more nuanced or complex visions of things that aren't just at seeing the world in black or white, whatever their belief system is.
I want to thank you. I want to mention also, among the other macro phenomena like, rising loneliness, or we could talk about COVID or social media. There's also some economic trends happening in higher education right now. Jan, if I could bring you in again, you've written a little bit about, what it means for students who come to campus and see themselves or are encouraged to see themselves as something close to customers, rather than a more traditional conception of a student. Can you tell us about what you've seen as an administrator and why that might be related to these questions of free speech?
So it's definitely related. I don't want to lose a thought that was just prompted, and I'll come back to this
Sure.
Customer dynamic. So just for the participants or the attendees, I've written an article related to basically framing university and the retail model, that's the way many students, including some grad students, have framed and seen themselves as the customer. And so I challenge that. I want to come back to actually what we're doing right now, and also how this signals and what's important for students. So Kevin and Jay just disagreed, okay, on something. And they're both smiling right now, okay? So, and what Jay said about social media, I'm jotting notes here because this is the beauty of the academy. I enjoy this stuff. This is one reason why we're here, and I miss these conversations. For me, life is in seminar. All right, so this is enjoyable. So let me make this point. So we have to show students how you can disagree without being disagreeable. They're both smiling. There was a challenge. But I'm bringing social media in here. More than the post, I end up scrolling through the comments. I want to see how people are reacting to what they're seeing. It doesn't matter whether it's music or a political screed or something, and I'm reading the comments, and the extremes are all in the comments, more so arguably than the post, where someone is just so critical, hypercritical and disrespectful. And then somebody jumps in on that one, and then people keep on talking about. There has been, if anything, social media has taken the courtesy away from discourse because of the anonymity that's embedded in social media. arguably people will just go in and just say just disrespectful things. Now you have a generation of social media natives, not just digital natives, but social media natives, and compound that with what the pandemic has done. So we've got like three years of a pandemic impacting people, and they've been interacting in not in virtual worlds. And so when it comes down to sitting in front of people, they not only do they arguably not know how to communicate effectively, they don't know how to argue points effectively in a social situation that many of us had. So it's important for us to create that environment for them. So I can talk about consumers, but I want to push this out there. So it's an idea that this conversation is really just prompted, is that I'm not sure they know how to do it. And we haven't done the best job of demonstrating that. And in the classroom, I miss the classroom. I used to tell students, look, have contrary views, be that person who is a dissenter. I said, we can disagree, but we cannot be disrespectful. And we can disagree without being disagreeable. And I said, we're all students, we're all friends in here. As long as you don't talk about anybody's mama, we're gonna be okay. Okay. So that's the way I would set the tone and then just bring it. But I don't think many universities have done a good enough job of talking about how can we talk about this, and maybe we haven't done the best job of modeling it.
If any of our panelists want to build on that, feel free.
I 100% agree that I think I mentioned graduate student instructors and adjunct faculty. I think tenured faculty especially could take the charge in modeling what it looks like to have disagreeable, or not disagreeable moments, but moments in which we disagree. I think it was, I don't know if it was the U of A, but it was a university in Arizona recently did a session, or has a series of sessions on disagreeing with the professor, where it's a explicit, specific time to challenge your professor in a way that's not in a mob setting. It's one person going up with a question or a critique. They have to articulate their point of view, and they can have a brief dialogue. I think having a moment like that, or using something like HXA's curriculum, the dialectical thinking activity, I actually used this in my class this past term, and it's shocking and sad to see students. Let me give context for the exercise. The exercise is to pick any issue, have 3 pros and 3 cons. That's it. You don't have to personally endorse any, you just have to list things out. And none of my students picked any political issue at all, saying explicitly, I am afraid to talk about politics. I don't know what's going to happen. And it should perhaps not fall on the people with employment precarity to start endorsing these things. I think it does anyway, just by nature of who's doing the instruction now. But tenured faculty really, I don't think, have an excuse not to incorporate more diverse ideologies in their curriculum. All of the instruction or advising I've received on diversity in my curriculum or in my syllabus has been about either gender, ethnic, racial diversity, yet somehow all of this variety of identities comes down to a very narrow scope of what is allowed to be said on given issues. So yes, I think professors taking the time to mentor their graduate students, to remind them to incorporate a diversity of ideologies in their syllabi, or taking time in class to allow students to challenge you and to incorporate diverse readings in your own syllabus. If professors aren't willing to actually practice what they preach in terms of listening to different people and perspectives and engaging with them respectfully, then students can't follow suit. They won't know how.
If I can just follow up on some of these points. I agree with everything that's been said here in the strongest possible terms. Actually, I think modeling behavior and disagreement, as Jan suggested, is crucial. I think pedagogically, there are things that we can do. All I will add to this is that I think we can learn a little bit about where we failed in selling some of our students on the value of academic freedom, freedom of expression more broadly, When we look at the data, for instance, and this is what my piece on the blog for Heterodox Academy was about, the marginalized groups that arguably historically have benefited most from norms of political tolerance and free expression are actually now most suspicious and least likely to endorse those values. So why has this happened? I think it's in part because we've done a poor job of speaking to groups in particular that historically have been marginalized. And there's kind of an ideological dimension to this. So research in political science, for what it's worth, which is not everything, consistently shows that liberals and conservatives talk about and think about politics differently. So conservatives talk and think about politics in terms of in largely philosophical or value-oriented terms. So if you track rhetoric of Republican politicians, for instance, they're frequently talking about liberty and tradition and patriotism and individualism. It all operates at the level of values. For Democrats and progressives and liberals, the focus is often on groups. So you hear a lot of rhetoric about African Americans or the LGBTQ community or the working class, but the way in which they think about politics and sell it is largely on the basis of who benefits and who pays the costs. And I think what has happened in universities is we've drifted too much in the direction of relying on values-based arguments to try to convince our students that free expression and tolerance are for them. And I think if we reframe some of our arguments, and my thinking on this has been incredibly persuaded by actually Jay's book, which I highly recommend to anybody who's thinking about not just free expression, but the relationships between groups, how to forge common identities and how to mobilize those identities in the direction of things that we favor. I think we need to have less of a division between people who are thinking, again, freedom, tradition, the Constitution, the First Amendment, free expression on the one hand, and people who see themselves as primarily looking out for historically marginalized groups. I think if we can find a way to rhetorically, again, not give up on the values ideas, but instead link the groups to values that liberals typically care about, concerns about harm, justice, fairness, equity. I think we can hopefully, again, sort of turn this around a little bit and start to communicate more persuasively to the students, again, that the survey data suggests are at minimum hesitant about endorsing these views at the moment.
Kevin, just to follow up on that. So are you suggesting that to make the case for more wide-ranging conversation, open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, there's more of a pragmatic argument to be made that there's something in the best interest of your group, or is it also just the types of values that we're talking about when we make those arguments?
Yeah, I think there is a pragmatic case to be made. And, again, I think that's probably where we have failed most. It's hard to identify exactly whether this failure is occurring before they arrive at the university or it's something that's happening at the university itself. So I would actually love to hear about high school education and curriculum decisions connected with some of these ideas. But again, just from the data that we have over the last couple of years, it's clear that groups, again, that have historically been again, the beneficiaries who've taken advantage, have been protected by constitutional protections, but I would even argue norms related to political tolerance are now, again, sort of reluctant to endorse them at the same levels that we might expect. So again, without knowing exactly where that disconnect is occurring, I think it's worth reflecting on how we might address that.
Thank you. So let me raise a couple of kind of criticisms of the line of argument or reasoning that we've been exploring today. One is that something about reporting self-censorship, as HXA does in our annual series of research reports, is a little odd. It's a little bit over-reliant on those same perceptions, and sometimes those of us who talk about self-censorship are also skeptical when other people are talking about, let's say, emotional harm. Should we be better off talking less, drawing less attention to perceptions and self-censorship? We had a question in the chat about whether that could actually backfire and send a message that it's actually normal to be scared about talking in class, when it'd be more effective to do the opposite. In other words, and I am sorry, I don't know which of you might like to weigh in on this first, but should we be talking more about courage in this conversation?
Yeah, I'll weigh in, since I think that very first, just because that question connects to the social norms issue I raised. Which I do think that there's lots of research that suggests that if you communicate the norm that people value dissent or free expression or whatever, that more people are going to engage in it. There is a risk of constantly saying there's no speech on campus, or people will be destroyed if they say something out of the blue, because even people who haven't yet encountered that experience will button up because they're worried that it might happen to them. And so it becomes what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's lots of research on campuses about false norms. So a famous research on this was around campus drinking. There's a binge drinking culture in dorms on campuses, has been for a long time. Well, it turns out if you survey the students, most of them don't actually like that culture, but they feel like they have to do it because everybody's doing it. But once you reveal that most people actually don't want to do that, then all of a sudden the people who felt pressured no longer feel pressured, and they're less likely to binge drink, and their performance improves, and their drinking goes down, and their dropout rates go down. And so, of course, it's figuring out, like, this goes to Kevin's point about how to frame it. What do students support? And then how could you measure that and then surface it in ways that reinforce a healthy norm? Because it turns out that that is like one of the easiest things you can do to unlock healthy behaviors. Just find out if people already support it, but they're not sure because they've been misled to believe something else. So I think like that is one of the first things you can do. And then obviously I think the second thing you need to do, and this is one of the most popular questions, was that you need institutional support. You need leaders in the institution, deans, the tenured professors. They're going to want to have to be the people who step up and back up the norm and enforce it, so that there isn't backsliding. And then it's going to be easier for the grad student teachers or the adjunct professors to speak up. It's hard to expect them to stick their neck out if they think the norm is not to challenge any orthodoxy. And then I'll say one last question and I'll shut up, is that I do want Kevin's point, I think, is really important. How do you frame it as a public good that everybody on campus benefits from? And I just was in this conversation yesterday on Twitter with there's threats to tenure. There's massive threats from governments to state institutions. This is a red state problem, not a blue state problem as much, threatening to take away tenure. And of course, academics scream and shout. It's horrifying to academics. And they say this is a threat to academic freedom and blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't think that resonates with anybody. I don't think the average citizen voter in those states gives a shit about academic freedom. Most people don't even know what that means. But what they care about is having good post-secondary education for their kids to go to college, right? They care about these institutions because most citizens have some aspiration that they hope their kids will go to a good college. They want their kids to go to one that has a good reputation, where they'll be challenged, where they'll learn things, where they'll be pushed. They want to get their money's worth. I go to the consumer point. So I think you want to use language about the value of tenure in terms of like producing, high quality education. You don't want to frame it through the lens of obscure abstract terms that only resonate amongst 1% of the population who's academics. So I think like we have to think about this from all threats to speech and academic freedom. How do we frame it in a way that citizens and the surrounding communities, voters and people who live in these academic environments and all levels of the academic hierarchy, from deans and provosts and presidents all the way down to grad students who are teaching these classes, can feel supported and understand that they're part of the mission of the university and that this is part of it.
Thank you. If there's no more discussion on that, maybe we will turn now to some questions from the Q&A.
So I'd like to go to the Q&A, but I've written this down. This is a very popular phrase among faculty, and that's just not at my institution. So these two words have been resounding over the past 2 years. I'm afraid. And then they fill in with what they're afraid of. I'm afraid to say this in class, or I'm afraid to share this with the students, or I'm afraid. And then I have a recently retiring chair, or is going to be retiring. And he said one of the reasons why is because of the classroom environment, and that people just express fear out of what they're going to, how students are going to respond to what they present. And I'm bringing this up as we're going into Q&A, but it's in response to what you were saying about the environments in which faculty members are teaching in. And it's a recurrent conversation. And I'm leading in this direction. So faculty don't even want to engage within the classroom in this type of debates. And it's related to what you said, Michael, related to about courage. So if faculty are afraid, students clearly may express that fear. And so courage is indeed important to engage this, but there's the consequences. So I'm thinking about this. So here's from the administrator perspective. So the reason why I hear all of that is because no one wants to be excoriated on social media. No one wants to get sent to the dean. I get the complaints from students. They get to the chair, and the chair forwards it to me. And so people don't know what to say. And so even while they're teaching the content that they've taught for 15 years, someone, and I just going to say this, there are some clear generational dynamics and what students bring to the classroom now is not what, and Megan, you were saying this, I remember what was said to me, basically keep my head down as well. Actually, the quote from Jim Pareko, who was my then chair, said, keep your head down, kid, and don't insult the dinosaurs and you'll get tenure. That's an exact quote. So I'm bringing this up to say, that's not the generation now of keeping your head down and not insulting the dinosaurs of sorts. And so they're speaking out. They've been taught this. They've been taught to speak out and to talk and to chat. And authority doesn't really mean too much anymore.
I think the theme of generations is pretty prominent in a lot of our issues today. And as an elder millennial / Gen Xer, I really resent the whole thing because I'm still 22 in my own head. I want to raise another question that's come up several times in the chat. And we talked a little bit about freshman orientation, but that may last a few days. Students are coming in with a bunch of educational experiences before they arrive on campus. So is there part of this that should rightly fall to K-12 or even to college admissions? How do we think about the sort of rest of the pipeline here that leads students and sort of prepares them for a college experience? Anyone who'd like to take that?
Just briefly, we need to address it at the university level. I think K through 12 is handling so many things. This is just going to be one more thing. And not to say that they shouldn't model this throughout the entire time, but as a concentrated institutional effort that they need to do this, my argument is no. I'm saying we in the academy, we need to do this.
If I could just briefly follow up on Jan's point, I think one of the challenges we confront, and again, this is based on the recent data, survey data from FIRE for faculty members. One of the problems we challenge is that as a faculty, we're actually quite divided about the value of these norms. So if you look at the, again, the survey data, there are profound generational differences, talking about faculty members now, and ideological differences. So we're not even of a shared set of perspectives, I think, as a faculty, which makes moving forward strategically incredibly difficult. I think if we had a sort of shared sense of what our professional norms were, we could probably devise strategies that would be effective for communicating those to the students. I think one of the challenges is, partly for generational reasons, partly for political reasons, we're actually quite divided as a faculty about what the best way forward is. And I've often talked about the emergence of, let's say, hyphenated professional identities. This is something even in my short time at the university I've seen, whereas people used to talk about themselves maybe as a scholar, maybe as a researcher, maybe as a teacher, but now we have these sort of hyphenated identities that are often followed by activist. I'm a teacher activist, I'm a researcher activist, I'm a scholar activist. And I think this represents a kind of fundamental divide that's going on within universities right now. How should we do our job? Is our job, to sort of steal Haidt's phrase from a couple of years ago, is our job to try to change the world, or is it to try to understand it? And I think unless we can settle that issue as a faculty, we're going to fail in this enterprise of trying to persuade the students.
Thank you. As we think about this larger theme of peer pressure, I think it's great to bring in the idea of faculty, because this doesn't only exist among students or with students and their perceptions of their professors. I'd love to hear if anyone has thoughts on what should be going on professionally. Is this a generational transformation in the faculty, in the way that we're exerting pressure on each other, or are there some lines of hope here, or some bright spots? I certainly talk to a lot of HXA members who don't feel comfortable speaking in faculty meetings, or feel like they've been experiencing sometimes extreme forms of social pressure, even to the point of being shunned or feeling like an outcast on your own campus. And given the isolated nature of academic work, that can be especially hard to deal with. But again, to Jay's earlier point, we don't want to overstate that phenomenon and say that the extreme is normal for everyone. Love to hear thoughts about this dynamic of peer pressure among faculty, and I suppose also among graduate students, the instructors, if you will.
I mean, I'll weigh in on the peer pressure thing. So there is peer pressure that happens for all kinds of things. You know, we've been dealing with peer pressure, all of us, since we were kids. And it goes throughout life. And the pressure to conform to a certain behavior or belief can be really strong. And the research on conformity, the famous research, people will conform to something and say something that's untrue if they feel that everybody else is going along with it. And so I think one thing you have to think about is, how can you create context where people can be more honest about their expressions? I think one thing, I'll just give you an example of the dynamics around this. So I run a social psychology program. We have faculty meetings. Sometimes we'll have very heated discussions amongst ourselves about something, and you'll think, wow, it's a really torn issue. And then I'll do an anonymous vote. I do a ton of anonymous votes, by the way. And it will be 14-1 against the person who was arguing the whole time. And you didn't realize, but no one was on board with it, even though they were passionate about it. And they didn't succeed in convincing anybody. And so you have a forum where there's lots of debate, but then you have the anonymous vote. And what I found that does repeatedly is it empowers people who are uncomfortable to speak up, gives them equal weight in decision-making. It especially predicts the people who are at the margins, in this case, the lowest powered people, that don't, Jan's point about don't irritate, don't insult the dinosaurs. That's a tip for junior faculty or untenured faculty. They feel much, suddenly they can express themselves without having to stick their neck out. And so there are mechanisms that, I'm a social psychologist, so I do this all the time because I understand the psychology of people who are saying something or biting their tongue, and it creates an illusion of consensus that's not actually there. And in the famous research on conformity, the Ash experiments, people would say a line is longer than they knew it to be if everybody else was doing the same thing. But the moment they could write a private answer, they gave the truth. And so we have to think about what are the structures that are going to make people feel comfortable expressing truth. And some of those are like reasonably easy fixes. So this one allows them to express truth, and it leverages a healthy democracy, even if it's in a small group of people. So you get democratic principles for decision making. So I would encourage like faculty and chairs and graduate programs to think, are you leveraging these tools that minimize the effects of conformity and peer pressure and enhance power and decision making among people who might feel disempowered, because they're the people who'll be first to bite their tongue.
We had a commenter in the Q&A say, seeing the option to answer anonymously here sort of gave him pause. But in fact, it sounds like you've been able to use that to positive effect and without stigma. It's an unusual practice, but it sounds like it's possible to sort of normalize that locally in a class or on a faculty group and make that a habit.
Yeah, and again, this is different from the effects of anonymity. Say, like, a lot of trolls on social media are anonymous and those harass people all day. This is different because you know the people that are part of the group and the community, and you're just giving them anonymity, not an anonymity for the decision-making process. So it's very different than a random stranger entering a group whose goal is just to disrupt and cause chaos or pain for people.
Right. Well, I want to leave time if any of our panelists had a last thought that you wrote down and we didn't get back around to, please speak now.
Jay just sold another book after this discussion, at least, so I'm buying.
Great. Thanks. I hope you like it.
Great. Well, I would love to keep going, but before we break, I want to make sure that for anyone who not only wants to buy Jay's book, but wants to follow all of our panelists after this, that they know where to do that. So I'll ask each of you, can you tell us where to find you online? What's something that you would recommend, whether it's a book, your Twitter account, or what have you, because we want to keep these conversations going, and I'm sure many of our members would love to connect. Kevin, maybe I can go to you first.
Yeah, I try not to be found, actually. So so don't look for me. No, I would recommend people after this discussion read my piece in Heterodox. I recommend Jay's book over anything that I probably have to say on this topic. I do have a book, however, called The Politics of the Pill, which is with Oxford University Press. It's a book on the politics connected with contraception access, so topical and timely. I would recommend people look for my work on that topic if they want to buy my books. Thanks.
Thank you. Megan, how about you?
I am also not really findable. My current project is my dissertation, which will not be out for some time and likely not of interest. But I do have a piece with HXA on why I think that DEI initiatives are often counterintuitive to creating viewpoint diversity and protecting people of non-white men identities. So I am not findable for now, but if I write more, do more, that may change.
Great. And you can find Megan at the next professional conference on medieval romance, right? Something like that.
Correct.
Jan?
No Twitter, no Facebook, nothing like that. Let's see. You can follow the college. So I run our college Instagram page at CSBS_CSUN if you want to know what's going on in the college. I do. Fortunately, I've got a book coming out this year on an unrelated topic, which is high impact practices with urban youth. Oxford University Press as well. Shout out to Kevin there. All right. And what else? And David, part of HXA California, had posted a link to the story you referenced, Michael. So, and thanks for the honor of inviting me. And like I said, I enjoy seminar is life. So I appreciate this panel discussion.
Absolutely. And finally, Jay, I know you're on Twitter. Where else can folks find you?
Yeah, Nicole just dropped my Twitter and my book link in the thread. So powerofus.online is where you can read summaries of the book, but also we have a free newsletter. My lab has a free monthly newsletter if you just want to follow our research. Our newsletter for our book is about themes around group dynamics and how we can make groups smarter and make better decisions. And we tackle all the issues we were talking about here. I just, by the way, so impressed that everybody here is non-findable in social media. I feel like that's like a special power in this modern era. And it takes like a certain boldness not to be connected. I'm too connected, so I post a lot of research on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you want to see studies and stuff on these type of topics, follow me there.
Great. And finally, I'll just reiterate, I hope everybody visits heterodoxacademy.org. We are getting ready to relaunch our website in the coming weeks, so that's a good spot to watch. And we're always accepting membership. If you're in higher ed, we'd love to have you, not only as part of our national organization, but we're starting campus communities. We have disciplinary communities who meet and get together. If you found some interesting topics here today, there's a lot more where that came from. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking our guests today. It's really been a wonderful conversation, and we will see all of you again for our next virtual event in just a couple of weeks. Thank you all.